Let's talk about ADHD and imposter syndrome. Everyone, ADHD or not, can experience imposter syndrome. And a lot of times people experience it as beginner's doubt, like they're new at something, don't have a ton of experience or expertise yet, but you got to start somewhere. And there can be a sense of like, I don't know if I know what I'm doing. And that can feel like imposter syndrome. And for sure, that's legit. And with ADHD, it can feel so much bigger than that. It might be why when you're talking to people and you're like, oh my gosh, I have imposter syndrome. They're like, I know, I just started this thing and I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. You're like, yeah, no, that's not what I'm talking about. And it's not that they don't feel imposter syndrome. It's just that there are things that we're going to talk about in a moment, three ways that imposter syndrome can be bigger for people with ADHD. And they're actually things that are not directly related to the traits or symptom picture, if you prefer the medical diagnosis of ADHD, but are secondary pieces that do tend to exacerbate imposter syndrome. So let's get into it. Number one, we know that people with ADHD as kids and adults are way more likely to be criticized, corrected, and receive negative commentary more than our non ADHD peers. Psychiatrist Michael Jelenic has estimated that over 20,000 negative critical and corrective comments more than our ADHD peers by age 10. That's a lot, and that starts to take a toll. And when people are constantly correcting you, telling you you're doing it wrong, and criticizing you, do you think that you really develop a lot of confidence in yourself? Like you're like, yeah, I'm pretty kick ass, right? And maybe in some areas, we're going to talk a little bit about that for those of us who mask through overfunctioning and high achievement. But even those of us that masked with overfunctioning and high achievement ended up still having our ADHD sneak out, unless you were really, really good at it. I don't know how you did it. But for me, I was an overfunctioner, high achiever. And so my report cards would all read excellent student, great grades, needs to pay attention better, or needs to talk less, or, right? Like all those things, interrupts too much, blurts out, talks too much, constantly talking. Whatever it was, my ADHD still came out. And that's what I was often corrected for. For some, it might be messy, disorganized, loses things, can't keep track of assignment. And so, in one way or another, a lot of our ADHD came out. And we tried to mask, many of us, in different ways. But that doesn't mean we didn't still receive correction, criticism, or negative commentary more than our non ADHD peers. And like I said, that takes a toll because when people are constantly correcting you and telling you, no, no, do it this way. Stop talking. You're too much, right? Whatever. Sorry, I might have heard that one. Then it's hard to believe in yourself. It's hard to trust that you are doing anything right, let alone the thing that you decide to study, which leads me to part two. So a lot of people have those unresolved wounds, that inner critic that developed from people correcting us and criticizing us. And so our own inner critic does that to us now and possibly people in our outside life. And if you are someone who masked through overachievement and high functioning, you might be like, I don't know, I feel pretty great. My self worth is great. Look at all the things I've accomplished. And externally, your self worth is kick ass because you're like, wow. And I used to be that way too. I was like, I think I struggle with self-worth, you know? I mean, I'm really smart, I have great grades, I graduated 10th in my class, blah, blah, blah. And that's great, except that that's only one area of your life where you're looking at your self-worth. And a lot of times, there can be other areas of our lives if we master through high achieving and over functioning, where maybe we don't feel as good, maybe socially for some of us, or staying organized, keeping track of things. And that can be really hard when you start to enter the workforce because unless you start out as an entrepreneur, most of us start out in lower level jobs that require enormous amounts of admin tasks, something that the ADHD brain is not particularly good at. We are much more skilled at those higher level thinking, creative, problem solving tasks, and not so much at the day to day little piddly admin. So it can be a struggle in our first jobs because even though we work really hard, we find ourselves working harder than everyone else to get stuff done. And a lot of times it's because that admin stuff. And so we might in some way feel like we're an imposter or have doubt, but this certainly shows up once you become an entrepreneur because now it's you. It's all you. You're putting yourself out there. You're saying, hey, I offer something that's really great. And that's when that fear and doubt can start to show up and what I would call imposter syndrome, especially because if you received accolades for your high achievement as a kid and didn't get in as much trouble for your ADHD moments because of it, that goes away with entrepreneurship because there's no A, there's no raise unless you give yourself one. There's no external review unless you count reviews people leave you, but sometimes those are positive and sometimes they're just harsh because people on the internet forget there's a human on the other side of their commentary. And so if you're only relying on external feedback to feel good about yourself and recognizing that initially there's not a lot of external feedback because you're just trying to get your stuff out there and have eyes on, then you're going to start to feel more and more like an imposter, like, oh my gosh, maybe I can't do this. And so if you're in that camp, where you're feeling like an imposter because you're used to achievement and then all of a sudden you don't get any of that external feedback. For you, it's going to be recognizing like, oh, okay, yes, where can I acknowledge my strengths? Where do I see that I know what I'm doing? I know what I'm talking about. And give yourself confidence boost as well as work with the parts of you who feel like you don't know what you're doing because there's something inside that's scared. Something inside of you is like, I don't know, maybe afraid of being judged or criticized. And so there's some work to do there to overcome that fear, that doubt, that imposter syndrome that can pop up. Now, some people did not mask through high achievement and over functioning for whatever reason. I know as someone who masked through high achievement and over functioning, the reason I was able to, I had a loving family, all my basic needs were met. Yeah, there was some stuff occasionally, but really baseline stuff always met, survival needs always met, love needs met. And so, yeah, the criticism and all that, great. But when your basic needs are met, then you are able to perform in other ways. I don't necessarily mean performative, but maybe performative, I guess, the masking, right? But you're able to do things that maybe you couldn't do if you're worried about food on the table, a roof over your head, or being safe in your home. And so some people with ADHD ended up being called like underachievers. You're not reaching your potential. And sometimes it had nothing to do with anything. It had maybe you had a lovely home and you still were always told like, "Oh, you're not reaching your potential. You're so smart, but you're not doing anything." And if that's your story, there's lots of reasons why you could get there. Imposter syndrome might look different for you. It might be that you're like, "I don't have all these achievements. I've never been able to do very much." Or the things I've done, I breezed through them because sometimes people who are quote unquote underachievers with ADHD, not my word, other people's word that I hear from people, but other people who are underachievers with ADHD, sometimes the situation is that you're so smart, things are so easy, you're like, why would I put energy into that thing? I had a friend like that growing up, and she just struggled to get herself to do so. She's really, really bright, aced the ACTs, all that stuff, whereas standardized tests were not my friend. I had a hard time focusing and getting it done in that time frame. But she would do so well, but her grades weren't fantastic because it wasn't worth her time because it was easy for her. So sometimes the underachieving can also be a function of your intelligence, not just not having the love you need in your home or support or survival needs. But whatever it is, if you get to a point where your intelligence, you're no longer able to outsmart the need to do some of the other stuff, you might start to feel like an imposter. And certainly, as you're trying to get yourself to do stuff for your business, which is a lot of those boring things that you avoided doing when you were younger because they were boring and meaningless and didn't seem helpful, then you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And you're going to feel like an imposter. And so in this situation, it's more about leaning in, getting curious and saying, okay, where is it that I'm feeling an imposter? Where am I struggling? Where are my strengths? Kind of similar to the over functioning high achievement people. It's going to be leaning in and getting curious. What's this about? Where is this coming from? Leaning into your strengths and then potentially hiring out for some of the boring stuff, finding a virtual assistant, or I have someone do my bookkeeping. I know how to do bookkeeping. I was an accounting major for the first 2 years of college and then did financial analysis and pricing for an insurance company in my actuary days for almost 4 years. So it's not like I don't know how. It's just getting myself to do it is hard. And then when I don't do it, I feel like I shouldn't own a business because it's like, oh my God, I can't even do the basic stuff like this. Right. So if you are in that situation, then it's about figuring out like, okay, where is my expertise and how can I play to that? And if you're like, I don't have any expertise, I don't know, because maybe you didn't do so well academically, perhaps, I'm thinking, or maybe even in a job because you just were like, oh, pointless, pointless, this is meaningless. Then perhaps it's really leaning in and being like, well, what do people ask you for? And why did they come to you? And starting to understand, like, look for the evidence that shows that you, in fact, are an expert in something. It doesn't mean you're not just because you didn't get a good grade in something or get a raise. Those things are more based on performance of what neurotypical performance looks like. But I want to get to something that is important to consider for all imposter syndrome, whether you have ADHD or not. And it's this: no one starting out knows everything, and no one at the end of their career knows everything. You just have to know a little bit more than the people you're serving. So I remember when I first started teaching yoga, it was a little frightening, although I was a group fitness instructor. And at that time, I'd been teaching group fitness for over a decade. So it wasn't like I didn't know the body. And I was only about halfway through my yoga teacher training. And the place where I was teaching group fitness was like, hey, we need someone to teach this yoga class. We know you're in your yoga teacher training. Can you teach it? Talk about imposter syndrome. But they needed someone to teach it. I certainly was skilled. I knew how to teach. I'd been teaching for years. I knew about bodies and alignment and not injuring people. And so for me, it was just some of the extra yoga pieces. I worked very, very hard to prep for each class because I was still studying yoga, right? I was still learning how to be a yoga teacher. I went and taught my first class, and it's like the only people that probably even would have noticed that I was not an experienced yoga teacher was yoga teachers. And I would hope if they're yoga teachers, they're practicing enough yoga that they would be filled with compassion because they remember what it was like for them when they taught their first yoga class. But what I remember after teaching was people were like, that was such a great class. Oh my gosh, one of my favorite yoga classes ever. And I was like, okay. Like, right? Because I didn't feel like I had the expertise to be teaching a yoga class. But I had more expertise in yoga than the people I was helping that day, than the people I was serving. And so to them, I was an expert. I was a yoga teacher because I had just taught yoga. Teaching yoga equals yoga teacher, kind of. I mean, And so it didn't matter to them that I didn't know every single Sanskrit name for every single yoga asana or pose, right? Like they didn't care. They didn't care that I hadn't read all of the Yoga Sutras yet or the Bhagavad Gita at all. No one cared about that. They just wanted to come to a yoga class, move their body, and feel better when they left. The same is true for you. When your people come to you, they want to have an experience. They want a transformation. They don't care about how long you've been doing this. I mean, maybe they do to get in the door a little bit, but if you know what you're talking about and can reach the audience that you're wanting to serve, then you just need to be a few steps beyond where they're at. When I say beyond, I don't mean like better than, but I just mean a little bit more knowledge. You don't have to be the leading expert on the planet for anything to teach people that are not really familiar with your topic. Now, if as a person in my yoga teacher training who taught yoga, I thought I was going to go out and teach yoga teachers how to teach yoga, okay, that would have been like legit. I would have been an imposter because since I did not have the skill set for that yet. But a lot of times with imposter syndrome, if you can recognize that you are just enough steps in your journey to be able to help someone who is not quite in that part of the journey yet, then you're an expert to them. So that is a way to help with imposter syndrome, whether you have ADHD or not, whether you have those wounds of ADHD that I was talking about, whether or not you are used to high achieving and getting accolades and now are an entrepreneur and maybe you get an occasional thumbs up or a positive comment on your social media and you're like, oh, cool. But generally speaking, the praise, the feedback is few and far between. You definitely get haters though, right? Like if you're putting yourself out there enough. And so you do get the negative feedback. So imposter syndrome is real. And if you can lean in and get curious what it's about for you, then you can start to overcome. I would love it if you'd subscribe to my channel. And if you want more information about how to work with me, including some free opportunities as well as paid programming, make sure you check out the description. Take care.